So Anin, Bojo, Dansei, Wochie, Hohan, Tanshi, Tungatsuitsi. We acknowledge the fact that we are guests on this land, and we would like to thank the people of Treaty 1 territory. This webinar is located on Treaty 1 territory, the original lands of the Anishinaabeg, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. We encourage you to reflect on the history of the land that you are watching from. Beyond reflect, please learn about whose land you are on, and you can do so by visiting Whose Land online and by clicking the link below. So, webinar housekeeping. If you have any tech issues, the MAO will do its best to help. You can call us at 204 945 7613. And if you have any questions for our presenters or panelists, we just ask that you type them in the chat box below. And we'll get to your questions near the end of the webinar. And if you prefer to ask your questions privately, you can email mao@gov.mb.ca, and we will get back to you following the webinar. And just a reminder, ASL is offered throughout the webinar, and closed captions are available by clicking the CC Live Transcript button in the lower corner. And if you're having trouble viewing the ASL or speaker, just please change your view settings. And if that still doesn't work, let us know in the chat box and we'd be happy to help you. All right, so without further ado, I'll welcome Jutta Frick to the screen.
Hi, my name is Jutta Frick, and I'm the Executive Director at the Manitoba Accessibility Office, also called MAO today. And at the MAO, we're responsible for the development and implementation of the Accessibility for Manitobans Act and the accompanying standards. As in previous years, today on the International Day of Persons with Disabilities, we're happy to share a webinar with you and to celebrate the day, which was set in 1992 to promote people's dignity, rights, and well-being in all spheres of life. With the adoption in 2006 of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the United Nations provided further direction to signatories like Canada on how to ensure the inclusion of people with disabilities in every aspect of political, social, economic, and cultural life. This year, our focus is on the rights of people who rely on service animals, which are addressed by the UN Convention's Article 9 on accessibility and Articles 18 and 20, which target liberty of movement and personal mobility. For example, Article 20 commits signatories to ensure the greatest possible independence for persons with disabilities, including with the support of service animals. Next slide, please. So to celebrate the day, we will begin with greetings and opening remarks from the Honorable Rochelle Squires. Then we will have a presentation about the rights of Manitobans with disabilities and how they affect people with service animals, with Karen Sharma from the Manitoba Human Rights Commission and Lucia Madariaga from the Accessibility Compliance Secretariat. Almost always, the highlights of our webinars are the expertise shared by people living with disabilities. And no different today, we welcome as moderator Yvonne Peters and panelists Vivi Davey and Bill Tucker. There will be time for questions and answers, as mentioned by Erica, including through chat during the event. Plus, we asked in advance this year for questions that are pertinent to restaurants and hotels, and our panelists will be sharing that information. The event will end with a few closing remarks and resources to keep you busy in the future. Next slide, please. So at this time, I welcome the Honorable Rochelle Squires, Minister of Families and Minister responsible for accessibility. Minister Squires was elected as the MLA for Riel in 2016 and then again in 2019. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in Communications from the University of Winnipeg, a Master of Fine Arts from the University of British Columbia, and a journalism diploma from Red River College. She and her husband Daniel have a combined family of 5 children and 1 grandson. Welcome to Minister Squires.
On behalf of the province of Manitoba and my colleagues in the legislature, I am honored to bring greetings on this, the International Day of Persons with Disabilities, when Manitoba joins people across the world in promoting the rights and well-beings of persons with disabilities. I would like to acknowledge that this webinar is being hosted on Treaty 1 territory, the traditional land of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. I wish to welcome the many champions of accessibility, including businesses, nonprofit organizations, and members of Manitoba's disability community to this webinar. We are once again meeting virtually due to the pandemic, but I want to assure you of the government's ongoing commitment to the accessibility needs of Manitobans with disabilities as part of our continued response to the pandemic. On International Day of Persons with Disabilities, the province recommits to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and to the implementation of all 5 accessibility standards under the Accessibility for Manitobans Act. I am proud of the government's accomplishments in developing, implementing, and reviewing the standards under the AMA. Most recently, the Accessibility Advisory Council completed its 5-year review of the accessibility standard for customer service. The government shared the Council's report and 22 recommendations with the public via a news release on November 10th of this year, and has already begun acting on these recommendations. You can view the full report at accessibilitymb.ca. I wish to thank the individuals and organizations who participated in the review by attending focus groups and webinars, submitting written feedback, and completing the survey posted on EngageMB. The province is also pleased with the progress on developing the remaining 3 standards despite the additional challenges of the pandemic. Earlier this year, the government conducted a second 60-day consultation on the accessibility standard for information and communications. Stakeholders provided significant feedback, which government is considering before finalizing this standard sometime in 2022. In the meantime, our department is leading cross-departmental work to prepare the government's proposals for the remaining 2 accessibility standards affecting the design of public spaces and transportation for public consultation later in 2022. I also wish to thank the many Manitoba employers who have complied with all requirements of the accessibility standards for employment in advance of the May 1st, 2022 deadline. This standard calls on Manitoba's employers to provide accessibility accommodations during all phases of employment, the beginning, during recruitment, and including accommodations during employment or return to work. Creating awareness about accessibility and inclusion is a cornerstone of standard implementation. I am pleased that for the first time, Manitoba proclaimed November as Indigenous Disability Awareness Month. We join fellow governments, communities, organizations, and people around the world in promoting awareness of the barriers faced by Indigenous people living with disabilities. I wish to recognize and sincerely thank the British Columbia Aboriginal Network on Disability Society for their leadership in celebrating Indigenous Disability Awareness Month. I am pleased to announce the Manitoba government is now providing online training and certification to support the 2 accessibility standards in place affecting employment and customer service. You can access this training and a variety of tools and resources free of charge by visiting accessibilitymb.ca. In addition to these free tools, templates, and training created by the Manitoba Accessibility Office, the Manitoba government has responded to the request from organizations for financial resources. Beginning spring of 2022, the Manitoba government will distribute grants of up to $50,000 each through the Manitoba Accessibility Fund. The purpose of these grants will be to support Manitoba's initiatives in line with the Accessibility for Manitobans Act and the standards. In closing, I wish everyone well on this International Day of Persons with Disabilities and an informative webinar on promoting and protecting the rights of people who use service animals. Our department receives many questions about this important topic, and I am grateful to our panel of experts for addressing many of them today. I wish you continued good health as we enter our second holiday season during the pandemic. Please stay safe and well. Thank you. Merci beaucoup, miigwech.
Thank you, Minister Squires. So this gives me a chance now to introduce our two presenters who will give you an overview of the human rights and accessibility laws that help serve people who use service animals. Our first presenter will be Karen Sharma, the Executive Director of the Human Rights Commission. She's a first-generation South Asian living in Winnipeg, Treaty 1 territory. And as Executive Director of the Commission, she leads the promotion and protection of human rights in Manitoba through the administration of Manitoba's human rights complaint system, the development of policy and research, and the delivery of human rights education. Karen is the chair of the Board of Directors of the Women's Health Clinic and is a co-organizer with Queer People of Color Winnipeg. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here for the International Day of Persons with Disabilities, and in particular to be celebrating the rights of people with disabilities who rely upon service animals. In a moment, I'm just going to share my screen, and I have a PowerPoint that I'm going to lead us through today. And I'll ensure that I describe what's on the slide here so that you can follow along with me. Okay, so the focus of my presentation today will be the rights of persons who use service animals, in particular focusing on the rights of individuals who use service animals under Manitoba's Human Rights Code, which is the statute, the law that our office, the Manitoba Human Rights Commission, is responsible for administering. So the way that I plan to conduct today's session is I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of Manitoba's Human Rights Code, our human rights law generally, and then I'll discuss in more specific detail the rights of people with disabilities who rely upon service animals under our Human Rights Code. Okay, so on the screen now before you should be a quote that says, "Recognizing the individual worth and dignity of every member of the human family." And as outlined on the slide, this quote comes to us directly from the preamble, so the introductory paragraphs of Manitoba's Human Rights Code, which is the law that I'll be discussing today. Now, this statement really is the cornerstone and fundamental to human rights law. It comes to us from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which Jutta mentioned earlier, an international treaty, and it's really a foundational principle across all human rights law. It emphasizes the notion that every person is born free and equal in dignity and in rights. Every person is entitled to have their worth and dignity recognized and affirmed. So it really, truly is the beginning or starting point of human rights law, this notion that we are all born free and equal in dignity and rights. As I noted earlier, this principle comes to us directly from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And on the screen, you'll see on the left-hand side, the logo or sort of insignia of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it really is encapsulated in some of the beginning paragraphs of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UDHR, which talks about every person being born free and equal. Not only is it affirmed in the UDHR, but this notion that every person is entitled to dignity and rights is also affirmed in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which we heard about earlier, which promotes, protects, and ensures the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by all persons with disabilities as a way of promoting respect for their inherent dignity. So what these laws tell us is that there are instruments and codes in place to ensure and guarantee the rights of persons with disabilities. But let me come in more detail to Manitoba's specific law, the Human Rights Code. So Manitoba's Human Rights Code establishes, again, that every person should have their worth and dignity recognized. And it does that by prohibiting or sort of banning unreasonable discrimination on the basis of a protected characteristic. And I'll come back to this notion of what unreasonable discrimination is and what protected characteristics are in a moment. But in essence, Manitoba's law is all about ensuring that no one experiences illegitimate or unreasonable discrimination in places like their work, when they're accessing any service that's available to the public, in housing, in contracts, etc. So the code not only establishes that people cannot engage in unreasonable discrimination, it also sets out a process by which people can make complaints of discrimination to us if they feel like their rights have been violated in this way. And our job at the Manitoba Human Rights Commission is to oversee this complaint process, but also to educate the public on human rights more generally. So we do this through education by publishing policies, research, guidelines, fact sheets, etc. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about specific guidelines and fact sheets that relate to the topic of people with disabilities who rely upon service animals. So coming back to the definition of discrimination. So I mentioned that Manitoba's Human Rights Code prohibits or bans discrimination that's unreasonable discrimination on the basis of a protected characteristic. Now, human rights law has evolved to understand or define discrimination in a few different ways. The first is when we treat somebody differently on the basis of a characteristic, so an aspect of their identity. And I'll come back to what a protected characteristic is under our code in just a minute, without having a reasonable cause or justification for doing so. So when we, perhaps treat somebody negatively, for example, terminate their employment or deny them access to a public service without having a good justification for that kind of treatment. And that justification often relates to things like an issue of public safety, a significant cost, etc. Discrimination is not only treating a person differently, it can also mean failing to reasonably accommodate the needs of a person where those needs are based on a protected characteristic. What that really is all about is removing barriers to equality for people with disabilities or for people with any protected characteristic under our code. So removing those barriers, ensuring equality of opportunity and access for individuals under our Human Rights Code. The Human Rights Code also prohibits harassment on the basis of a protected characteristic and protects people from experiencing retaliation if they choose to enforce their human rights in some way. For example, if they lay a complaint under our code, they shouldn't then have their shifts or hours cut at work. Or if they refuse to contravene the Human Rights Code, they shouldn't then see some sort of negative treatment or punishment for doing so. So these are the kinds of conduct that our Human Rights Code prohibits or indicates are not allowed in Manitoba. And again, the complaint process allows individuals to file human rights complaints if they feel that their rights have been violated in some way. Now, I mentioned that discrimination is when you're treated differently or negatively, or your needs are not accommodated, where those needs relate to what we call protected characteristics or grounds. And this is kind of a mouthful, the idea of protected characteristics. But what it really means are aspects of a person's identity that go to sort of the core of who they are, that you can't easily change about yourself, and that people have often times experienced negative treatment or disadvantage on the basis of. There are things which are listed on the screen here, like your ancestry, including your race, your nationality or your ethnicity, your religious belief, your age, your sex or your gender identity, your sexuality, marital or family status, your source of income, political belief, and circumstances related to social disadvantage, like experiencing homelessness or having the experience of chronic low income. And most importantly for our conversation today, the Human Rights Code also protects people from discrimination on the basis of a physical or mental disability, which includes reliance upon remedial devices like wheelchairs, as well as reliance upon a service animal. So what this means is that under Manitoba's Human Rights Code, persons with disabilities who rely upon service animals have the right to live free from unreasonable discrimination and harassment. Now, this fundamental right means that persons with disabilities who rely upon service animals have the right of access to public spaces on an equal level with others without experiencing unreasonable discrimination. And they also have the right to reasonable accommodation up until the point of undue hardship. And I'll give you some examples of that in a moment. But let's first talk a little bit about how Manitoba's Human Rights Code defines a service animal, because unlike perhaps other laws across Canada, our Human Rights Code is quite deliberate in that one of the first sections of our Human Rights Code specifically defines what a service animal is, and therefore what kinds of service animals are in and that people with disabilities rely upon are entitled to human rights protection under Manitoba's Human Rights Code. So the Human Rights Code defines a service animal as an animal that has been trained to provide assistance to a person with a disability that relates to that person's disability. So very particular here, a service animal under our code is an animal that's been trained and it provides assistance to a person with a disability, again, in ways that relate specifically to that disability. Now, the type of assistance that a service animal provides may vary, and it is evolving. So for example, in popular culture, we might be quite familiar with representations of guide dogs, whether that's seeing eye dogs or hearing ear dogs. However, we know that the kinds of support and assistance service animals provide has evolved, and service animals may also support mental health conditions, for example, post-traumatic stress disorder, et cetera. And I'll give you an example of a case that involves a service animal that assists with a mental health condition in a moment. Another important point that's captured in Manitoba's definition of a service animal is that service animals, while they're often dogs, are not always going to necessarily be dogs. So service animals can be other animals as well. Now, service animals are typically easy to identify. They may be wearing a vest or a special harness, and oftentimes service animals, or I should say, at all times when they're working, service animals are under the care and control of the person that they are assisting. It's important to note that there is no standardized identification or certification scheme for service animals in Manitoba. That means that a person with a disability who relies upon a service animal may not have a card or some sort of standardized piece of identification related to their animal. And if you have an interest in this topic, you may wish to review some of the Commission's statements on this issue, which we recognize certification standards or standardized identification schemes could present additional barriers to people with disabilities who use service animals. But that's a side point. For the purpose of defining a service animal, what's important to recognize is that at this time in Manitoba, there is no standardized identification or certification scheme. Similarly, service animals may not always have attended an accredited or sort of formalized training program. What this means is that service animals can also be self-trained or trained through some sort of other program. And that's important because sometimes training programs can be difficult to access. They can be quite costly, and they can sometimes have wait lists, or the training programs can also be located out of province or country. Now, under Manitoba's Human Rights Code, we also recognize that we should take a really broad interpretation of service animal to include the fact that service animals may not always be called service animals. They could be called a guide animal or dog, a therapy dog, etc. But what is really important about a service animal, based on our definition in our Human Rights Code, is that they are animals that are trained to provide assistance to a person with a disability-related need, and that our focus in human rights law is on the rights of a person with a disability who relies upon a service animal. Now, what we know in Manitoba is that persons with disabilities who rely upon service animals continue to experience barriers to equality. And we're learning about the nature of these barriers through our complaint system and the kinds of concerns that are brought to the Manitoba Human Rights Commission. They include barriers like accessing public services with a service animal, for example, hotels, restaurants, public transportation, taxi systems, etc. Barriers to accommodation of persons with service animals in employment or in other contexts. Concerns of competing rights scenarios where the rights of a person who relies upon a service animal appear to conflict with the equality rights of others. A lack of training or knowledge in what a service animal is, how they work, and how to respectfully engage with a service animal who is working. So we know these barriers to equality exist for people who rely upon service animals. While these barriers exist, our Human Rights Code has been effectively used to advance the rights of service animal users. And here I point to a recent case from Manitoba's Human Rights Tribunal entitled The Webb versus Manigaming Resort. It's a 2020 decision which really affirmed the rights of service animal users, people with disabilities who rely upon service animals. In this case, the complainant relied upon a service animal to assist with a mental health condition. And a number of years ago, the complainant and his family had made a reservation to stay at a resort, which included, as part of the reservation, access to the resort's many amenities like the pool, common areas, etc. However, when the family arrived at the resort, they were initially turned away because of the complainant's service animal. Later, the resort owners offered to allow the complainant and his family to stay at the resort, subject to the service animal entering and remaining in the hotel room through a distinct entrance, not leaving that hotel room, and therefore limiting the complainant's access to common areas, including the pool area, where the resort owners indicated the service animal was not allowed. The complainant and his family left the resort and ended their vacation early with, I'm sure, as you can imagine, all the feelings of upset at the way in which the complainant's dignity and rights were impacted in this scenario. Now, again, this matter was considered by our Human Rights Tribunal, who in the decision affirmed the rights of service animals to be able to access public spaces without experiencing unreasonable discrimination. On the slide, I have a quote from the decision that was issued again in 2020, and it states that it's at paragraph 72, Spencer was a service animal and not a pet, which is a critical distinction. The resort owners had an obligation to weigh their concerns with pets generally with Mr. Webb, so that's a complainant's specific disability-related needs, and his request to be treated no better or worse than any other guest staying at the resort. They had an obligation to ensure that services are accessible to individuals with protected characteristics under the code. So again, this decision really affirmed that service animal users, people with disabilities who rely upon service animals, where those animals have been trained to assist with a disability-related need, ought to experience equality when accessing public services and should have their needs related to their service animal and disability accommodated. Now, ensuring that we remove the barriers to equality for people who use service animals is a responsibility that we all bear. In particular, those of us who don't rely upon service animals and can advance these issues. The Commission has a number of resources available to the public to learn about our obligations to respect the rights of service animal users and how we maintain discrimination-free environments related to people who rely upon service animals. I've put up pictures of a few of these resources that are available on our website. So on the left-hand side, you'll see our guideline on discrimination against persons with disabilities who use service animals. We also have a fact sheet, which is just displayed in the center. And it has some tips, some really helpful hints and tips on how to define an animal, etc. And then finally, on the right-hand side is a slightly more legal document. It's our formal policy defining a service animal. All of those resources are available to the public to ensure that we all work to uphold the rights of people who rely upon service animals. And if ever you have questions about these issues, feel free to contact the Manitoba Human Rights Commission. You can email, phone us, or visit our website where we have lots of helpful hints and information. So I'll end there, and I look forward to the Q&A period where I can answer any additional questions you might have.
Thank you very much for that a good overview, a solid overview about the rights of people who use service animals. I think that's going to be very helpful for the panel discussion that follows. Now I'd like to welcome Lucia Madriaga, who is the Assistant Director of Manitoba's Accessibility Compliance Secretariat, which monitors and oversees compliance of accessibility requirements of the Accessibility for Manitobans Act. Prior to joining the Manitoba government in 2011, Lucia worked as a private consultant doing community-based research with newcomer communities in Manitoba. She earned a BA at the University of Winnipeg and an MA in political science from McGill University. Welcome, Lucia.
Good afternoon. My name is Lucia, and I'm very pleased to deliver this presentation on behalf of the Manitoba Accessibility Office and the Accessibility Compliance Secretariat of the Government of Manitoba. And this presentation will focus on service animals as they relate to accessibility legislation. And I will also offer some very general information as well as point to some resources developed by the Manitoba Accessibility Office on this topic. So the Accessibility for Manitobans Act became law in Manitoba in 2013. And one of the main goals of this legislation is for organizations in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors to really proactively identify, prevent, and remove barriers to participation. Another goal of the legislation is for Manitoba to make significant progress towards achieving accessibility by the year of 2023. It's important to note that the Accessibility for Manitobans Act complements the Human Rights Code, which has primacy, and in fact, the two accessibility regulations that are currently in force under the Accessibility for Manitobans Act, they adopt the same definition of a service animal as that found in the Human Rights Code, which, as Karen has mentioned, a service animal is an animal that has been trained to provide assistance to a person with a disability that relates to that person's disability. We like to think of accessibility standards as really the building blocks of the Accessibility for Manitobans Act. And the accessibility standard for customer service, which was passed in 2015 and is currently in force, has a section that references service animals. So Section 8 of this regulation notes that an organization's policies must recognize that a person who is disabled by a barrier may be accompanied by a service animal when they seek to obtain, use, or benefit from the organization's good or service. This regulation also requires that staff and volunteers in organizations, those who have direct contact with the public, that they take training which includes information on how to interact with a person who requires the assistance of a service animal. The accessibility standard for employment, passed in 2019, notes that employees and applicants must be reasonably accommodated in all stages of work, and that having a service animal may be an accommodation under this regulation. Similar to the previous standard that I mentioned, this standard requires that employers receive training on how to interact with an applicant or an employee who requires the assistance of a service animal. So what is some very general information and available resources that we can bring to your attention today? Well, as Karen Sharma mentioned, service animals are working animals that are really focused on meeting the needs of their handler, who may have a visible or an invisible disability. And oftentimes, although not always, dogs remain the most common form of service animals. People who use service animals have a right of access, the same access that the general public has. So for example, although every situation and circumstance is different, restrictions on access to someone with a service animal needs to be well-founded and will usually be the restrictions that are placed on other members of the public, such as operating theaters or medical laboratories as examples. We often say to service providers that when it's not clear whether an animal is a service animal, some limited questions can be asked, such as, is the dog a service animal required because of a disability? And what work or task has the animal been trained to perform? Oftentimes, handlers carry documentation supporting the need for a service animal, and they may show it to a service provider. And although it may be reasonable for landlords or employers to request documentation, again, in certain circumstances, in a situation where you have a one-time service relationship with a patron, the request for documentation may not be reasonable. And lastly, it's important to note that staff cannot ask about a person's disability or diagnosis or request that the dog or service animal demonstrate its ability to perform the work or task. Service providers can expect handlers to maintain control of the service animal, either physically or through voice, signals, or other means. And if the service animal is showing signs of not being trained, so it's snapping, barking, defecating, or whining excessively, service providers may provide a warning to the handler to control the animal. And if the service animal continues to misbehave, they may ask the handler to remove the animal from the premises. So the government of Manitoba has developed a number of resources in relation to service animals. On this slide, you will see an image. The first image is that of a large decal or sticker created by the Manitoba Accessibility Office in response to restaurant requests. And the image is that of a person with a service dog. The image has the Manitoba logo, and it states, "Service animals welcome, pets not allowed." And if your organization would like to order a decal, we encourage you to contact the Manitoba Accessibility Office. The second image on this slide is a one-page checklist that lists the requirements under the Accessible Customer Service Standard. And as you know, one of the requirements is to allow service animals on premises. We also have a frequently asked questions document, which is available on the Manitoba Accessibility website, as well as free training on accessible customer service. And if there are any resources which you feel as participants are missing, we really encourage you to let us know. We welcome your ideas, and we're very cognizant that this field is evolving, particularly the field of, how service animals can support those with invisible disabilities. So because this field is evolving, we recognize that oftentimes new tools and information may need to be developed to further remove barriers and encourage full participation. So I'd like to thank you very much for your interest and your time.
Thank you very much, Lucia, for adding that information. And I'll just add one thing that Lucia mentioned, that the work done by the Manitoba Accessibility Office and the Compliance Secretariat complement the Manitoba Human Rights Commission. And at the beginning of Karen's presentation, she mentioned that it's complaints-based. In comparison, the Accessibility for Manitobans Act sets out requirements for employers, and it's proactive in giving new deadlines for requirements. We'll mention a couple of others standards at the end of today's session, but I don't want to delay because I know everybody's anxious to hear the panelists, and I know a number of people have provided questions through the chat. I believe the panelists will address some of these, so stay tuned, and there will be time for questions at the very end. So it's nice to see everybody so engaged today. So at this time, I'd like to welcome our panel, being moderated by Yvonne Peters, who is a true friend of the Manitoba Accessibility Office. She's actually been the chair of our Accessibility Advisory Council, which was mandated to develop standards under the Accessibility for Manitobans Act. She's also a past chairperson of the Manitoba Human Rights Commission. So she is expert not only in having been a long-time service animal user, I believe she said 6 service animals at this point, but she also, you couldn't ask for anyone more expert on Manitoba human rights. I also want to point out that as a young disability advocate, Yvonne was among the disability advocates that helped ensure the characteristics protected in Section 15 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, not yet mentioned today, but it includes disability. So there are protections on many different levels, and we're glad and thank Yvonne for that work so many years ago. I'm also happy to introduce today Vivi Davey, who is the Advocacy and Community Outreach Program Lead for the CNIB Manitoba Division. Vivi holds a BA Honours in English from the University of Manitoba. She currently serves on boards which promote arts and culture and which advocate for accessibility. She's passionate about accessibility, diversity, and inclusion, and about exploring Winnipeg with her family, friends, and her guide dog companion. Our third panelist today is Bill Tucker, who joined the Manitoba government 6 years ago, initially in the area of skills and employment partnerships, and now in conservation and climate. Prior to joining government, Bill spent 10 years of his career with the Manitoba Liquor and Lotteries in the surveillance department, and the previous 10 years with Manitoba Start. So welcome our panelists, and we look forward to the discussion.
Well, hello, everyone. Happy International Day of Persons with Disabilities. Sorry, my phone is chattering too much. I really want to thank all of you who have tuned into this webinar. And I also want to say many thanks to the Manitoba Accessibility Office for choosing to focus on the issue of service animals for today's webinar. As indicated in the agenda, the next half hour or so, our three panelists are going to discuss a variety of issues which we as guide and service dog users encounter as we go through our day. And I'd like to begin, though, if I may, by making a few personal comments about language, because I do think it's important. And these are my own personal comments. First, I really prefer to use the term guide and service dogs rather than just service animal, because really most of the animals that are being trained to provide services to persons with disabilities are dogs. And they certainly seem to be the most trainable. And we've just looked to the United States, for example, where the Department of Transportation has now just indicated that a service animal is a service dog. There was some talk at one point of including miniature ponies or horses or something, but that seems to have gone by the wayside. So it's really often just about the dog. And I think even the Canadian Transportation Agency and the regulations that they're setting up regarding air transportation is also now referring specifically to service dogs. Secondly, I like to use the term guide and service dog, which is a mouthful. And obviously a guide dog falls under the general category of service dog. But I think it's really important to recognize and respect the fact that guide dogs have been working with blind persons for over 90 years in North America. In fact, in 2029, it'll be 100 years. And the use of the guide dog has been the inspiration behind the expanded concept of a service dog, which, I'm pleased to say now, really, we are looking to service dogs provide a variety of tasks for a variety of persons with disabilities, which is a good thing. So my own personal preference, I just like to use that phrase. So the main focus of the next discussion is on the barriers and misinformation that guide and service dog handlers often encounter. And I'm very pleased to be joined by my fellow panelists, Vivi Deby and Bill Tucker. And we've pulled together a series of questions and issues which we regularly encounter and which we are going to attempt to address. And hopefully we will also be able to provide some helpful advice and guidance on how businesses and members of the public can more effectively interact with a person who uses a guide or service dog. So let's just jump in right now. And the first question I'd like to ask my co-panelists is, why did you decide to work with a guide or service dog? What benefit did you see that it would make in your life? And if I may, I'll start with you, Vivi.
And sorry, I'm just going to jump in here quickly. It's Erica here. Vivi, your camera looks like it's on, but we can't see you right now. So just wanted to give you a heads up.
Yes, thanks, Emily. I noticed that issue before. It is on my end, but I'm not sure why the video isn't translating through. So.
Well, you can probably just continue with your.
Yeah, that's okay. We can hear you loud and clear.
Excellent voice, and
thanks.
We're more interested in what you have to say. So
thanks, Yvonne.
feel free to proceed.
Okay. So you asked me why I chose a guide service dog. And I suppose the main answer is I'm a very collaborative person. So I thrive very much on partnership. And when I used to encounter people with guide dogs before I was matched with my own, I just really had an appreciation for that relationship, the intimacy of the work that the team did together. And that was the main motivation. Not only that, of course, there is the unspoken companionship that working with a guide dog provides, and the added level of security, which isn't necessarily a factor when you train with a guide dog, but it is there in the loyalty and the working relationship as it develops over the years. But the primary reason why I chose to work with a guide dog is because it allowed me a different and, I would say, enhanced sense of mobility and independence as I navigated the world. Now, this is not to say that as a cane user, I wasn't mobile or independent, and many people aren't aware that before you are matched with a guide dog, you have to demonstrate that you are competent as a cane user. But I found that working with a guide dog just allowed me to navigate and exist in the world in a more seamless and fluid way than I had previously with working a cane. For example, a guide dog would lead me through a crowd of people as opposed to up to them with a cane, and then I'd have to figure out how to negotiate that. And they also navigate you up to obstacles and around as opposed to into them, which is still an effective way of detecting things in your surroundings. But it's, for me, it's just a more seamless and fluid way of existing in the world as a blind person.
Thank you. And Bill, tell us your story, how you chose to work with a dog.
My disabilities are hidden disabilities. And so they're not always obvious to people unless they know me well enough or I've disclosed to them. And so when I go out into the general public, I usually have to have somebody else with me, like my wife, for example, who understands my disabilities. That's not always possible. There are times where I have to go out into public on my own. And there were a couple of incidents where I needed the assistance of my wife or somebody who knew what was going on, and they weren't available. So I made the decision to look into whether a service dog would be appropriate for me or not. There are two sides of the coin to having a service dog. The positive side for me is that she has been trained now to respond to any physical or visible issues that occur, but she's also been trained to identify non-visible issues that occur with me and to perform a task when those things happen. The negative side of having a service dog when you have hidden disabilities is that it's labeled me as a person with disability. So my invisible disability or disabilities became visible disabilities by fact of by the fact that I have a service dog with me now.
And that leads me to my next question, which I think flows from what you just said, Bill, and that is, have either of you experienced accessibility issues because you have chosen to work with a guide or service dog? Have you been denied access? Have you been challenged because you are accompanied by a dog? And Bill, I'm going to start with you because you raised the issue of having hidden or non-visible disabilities. I think over time, people have become somewhat used to the idea of blind persons working with guide dogs and maybe have a little bit of familiarity with it, but it may be a newer concept when it comes to people who, don't have a visible disability. So I'll start with you in terms of any challenges, accessibility challenges that you've encountered while working with your service dog.
Yeah, thank you for that, Yvonne. I've been smiling and nodding the whole time you were asking the question. There are so many examples I could offer, but I'll try and keep them less provocative. One of my hidden disabilities requires that I visit a psychiatrist's office on a regular basis. And I recently wanted to attend a new psychiatrist who had moved into a new building. And I was actually stopped by the clinic manager and asked if I had documentation for my service dog. Well, Manitoba doesn't issue any type of registration documents, and the only documentation I do have is from my psychologist and my GP, which isn't a letter that I carry around with me on a regular basis. I only provided it for accommodation purposes. And so when I was asked what type of proof they wanted that my girl was a service dog, they said, your registration card. I'm sorry, I don't have a registration card. Okay, well then any kind of paperwork that you have that shows that she's a service dog. I don't have any paperwork. Well, then she's not a service dog. And I started to get into a confrontation, and part of my PTSD is I get anxiety when I'm confronted. It's a defense mechanism. And by the time the confrontation had ended, I was able to go into my psychiatrist's office. I was in no mental state to have a conversation with that psychiatrist. I had been brought into such a state of anxiety and panic that my brain was only focusing on what had just occurred and not what was supposed to occur. And so that for me was the most significant issue, was the lack of consideration that I'm obviously a person of disability because I have a service animal with me. I'm going for a psychiatrist's appointment, so you can take a pretty good guess at what my disability is. It's obviously going to, be something related to mental health. And now you're confronting me, and you're creating a major barrier to me, not just by potentially denying the service dog, but putting me in an inappropriate state of mind to go through with the medical appointment that I was supposed to be there for.
And I think these are just you raise such an important issue, I think, Bill, because yes, of course, I've been a guide dog user for 40 years or more, and I have certainly encountered my share of denials and questions and challenges. And the issue you raise, and we're all different in how we deal with these issues, but it is not a simple matter when this happens to you. It can be quite traumatic. It can produce anxiety. It's like I say, sometimes it tears a little piece of your soul out and you just never get it back. So it's not a minor thing when this happens. It can take a huge emotional toll. And, depending on your disability, that can even be magnified when these kinds of situations arise. So I certainly hear what you're saying in that regard. Vivi, what about you? Have you encountered any accessibility issues in your time with your guide dog?
Yes, I'll mention a few occasions. There were 2 instances on separate occasions where I was questioned about my guide dog when I entered a retail establishment, and the manager came up to me and said, "Oh, there are no pets allowed." And I just simply explained, it's not a pet, it's a working dog. And I pointed to her harness. And at the time she had a sign on her harness that said, "Please don't pet working dog." And that seemed to diffuse the situation. And on another occasion, I was going to the movies, and at the cinema, when I was paying for my ticket, I was informed that pets weren't allowed. And this was in a shopping mall, actually. So, we had been all the way through the mall to get to the cinema. And I said, "Well, it's not a pet, it's a working dog." And that's also, again, seemed to diffuse the situation. But the most extreme challenge I had, and I find it odd that I would experience such a challenge in the setting that I'm going to mention, but it was an academic setting where a classmate requested, not of me, first of all, of my professor, that my guide dog be nowhere near her because she stated that she had severe allergies. And at the time where we were situated in the classroom, we were, across the room from her. So there was no chance for this person to interact with my dog. He was harnessed at all times under my control. That didn't satisfy her. She wanted him then in a crate with the crate up against the wall. and with the blanket over the crate. So I would have no contact with my dog. He wouldn't be accessible to me under this scenario. And in case of an emergency, there would be a delay in him assisting me to exit the classroom and the building. And so this got accelerated because this student persisted on speaking to the professor teaching the class, the chair of our department, and our disability services office at the university I was attending at the time. And on each level of acceleration, I offered solutions. Before masks were commonplace, I suggested, well, could she not wear a mask? She already sits across the room from us. Could we not get a filter? But I consulted with the institution who trained my dog, and I said, you know, this is what's happening. Am I correct in asserting myself and refusing all of these requests? Because essentially this person was claiming that her disability was life-threatening if she was going to be in the same room as my dog. And I was reassured that, oh, absolutely, under no circumstances do you relent. But as you were indicating, Yvonne, it was very stressful and very emotionally taxing for me because it was the start of the semester and I had just returned from training with my dog. So I was not only learning, you know, my campus and my classroom, but we were still very, very new. So we were learning each other, and just to have this heaped on top of that, it was very traumatic. And I had, you know, conversations with my department chair to try to resolve this, but the other student just refused to speak to me and was unrelenting. And in the end, you know, how the situation concluded was that I was allowed to attend class, and the student would receive recordings of class if her allergies were going to be so severe that even being in the same room with us would incite her anaphylactic shock. So, or that's what she claimed, but that was just a very traumatic and distressing experience. And I wouldn't have even thought that that would have occurred in an academic setting, considering, you know, the purpose that we're there for is to enhance and increase our knowledge. So I was just, yeah, it still bothers me to reflect on it. It was just a very difficult time with initiating my new guide dog to my home and my campus life.
Well, and I think what you raised, Vivi, too, is not only are you working with a dog and learning, you know, maintaining that relationship, suddenly you have to become an advocate. And
Yes.
suddenly you have to become an ambassador. And that's that can be extremely stressful, as both of you pointed out. It certainly, it takes a lot of skill and perseverance. And I think you raise a really interesting question. I'm just going to dive into this one a little bit, though I won't go into it too deeply because it could go on and on forever. But the issue of so-called conflicting rights, and
Mhm.
often this happens where people claim to have an allergy. This really happens a lot with taxi drivers, but you certainly, you know, as you pointed out, can happen in other environments. And, you know, the thing, of course, if your allergy, in order for you to claim that you have a right, I would argue, you have to prove that that allergy creates a disability for you. So it's not just that it's a sniffle, that it really truly creates a disability that you would have to establish. You can't just self-declare. Like my taxi driver once told me that he had an allergy, and I said, "How was it diagnosed?" And he said, "By his wife, who was not a doctor." Uh, so, you know, you would need a specialist who would declare that this person, if it comes anywhere near a dog, is going to, you know, have some sort of a horrendous reaction. So it's not something you can just dream up and say. And in that case, then you know, exploration has to be done in terms of, you know, how can the two rights be accommodated. But I'm going to say that from what I understand, and I'm not a medical expert, but severe allergies to dogs where you know, are going to be severely compromised are pretty rare. But we can get back into the allergy discussion if we want to, or conflicting rights, later, and maybe we can ask Karen to jump in on this one too. But there's so many things to cover, so I'm going to keep us moving. Because one of the issues that we've already touched on is the issue of a business that says, prove your legitimacy, as Bill had to do. And when say, is this really truly a service dog, and how can you prove it? And so and part of this stems from the fact that we're a dog loving society. So now suddenly, over the last several years, everybody says that, wants to bring their dog with them everywhere they go. And that's lovely, but that's just not the way our society is operating at the moment. So rather than abiding by rules, what people start to do is they start to buy their fake IDs or fake vests and so on that says that they have a service animal or service dog, so that they can take their animal or their pet with them anywhere they go. And of course, things go wrong when that happens, because the pet is not trained, and training is the key here. And so businesses get really leery and really worried about who's coming into their establishment. So lots of ideas are out there about how to deal with this issue about who's legit and who isn't. And so again, I'm going to ask my co-panelists if you have any thoughts on what businesses can do to identify that the person before them with their dog is legitimate. Is it identification? Is it something else? So Bill, over to you. What do you have any thoughts? I mean, if you don't, that's fine. But if you do, we'd love to hear it.
Thanks, Yvonne. It comes down to the distinction, I think, between what's a pet and what a service dog actually, and how they behave. It's the behavior. Manitoba doesn't have a registration process, so there's no way to produce a registration document. And as you mentioned, Yvonne, you can go on the sites, especially down in the US, pay $10 and get an ID card. I have a Jack Russell, which is a non-traditional service dog. You normally expect a black lab or a golden retriever or a German shepherd. Those are sort of the typical dogs that come to mind when you say service dog. If anybody knows the Jack Russell breed, they're hyper, they are extremely energetic, they're very loving, they always want to play, they're yappy, and so when somebody sees a Jack Russell Terrier, that's the expected behavior. My dog does not behave like that at all, and I've had many compliments on the training that she's received and how well behaved she is. She listens to my commands. She's always under my control. She walks within 2 feet of me when she's on leash. She does wear a vest, but she's always paying attention to me. She's not looking around, looking at other people. She's paying attention to what's going on with me. She'll sit in a restaurant underneath my chair. She won't pick up scraps. She won't bark at other people. She won't try to sniff their legs as they walk by. It's all in that behavior structure for me that distinguishes a service dog from a pet or a therapy dog or any other type of animal that you would want to take in because you want to cuddle it and you feel good.
I just so agree with you. Absolutely. I think sometimes we overthink or overwork this issue. And as you say, Bill, it's the behavior. So if you walk into a restaurant or a shopping, center or a store or theater, and you see a team where the dog is responding to the handler's control or handler's instructions, it's paying attention to the handler, it's not sniffing, as you say, it's not eating scraps, it's not barking, it's not whining, it's as inobtrusive as possible and just doing its job. If you see a team doing that, you can be pretty confident that what you have is a trained dog, a trained team. And yes, maybe on certain rare occasions, you may have an exceptional pet that gets by that test, and they walk in and they're quiet and they lay under the table. But I'm going to say that's probably pretty darn rare, because most pets just, they haven't had the training. So, I think we need to be very careful about the identification registration issue. All you need to do is look to British Columbia, where they, with the best of intentions, introduced legislation specifically around registration and certification and carrying identification, and then proceeded to tell all the public, anybody in the public and businesses and so on, if you're not sure, ask them to produce identification. So in British Columbia, you could go through your day and maybe you're going into 5 or 6 or more establishments a day, and each time you're stopped at the door, and as my friends like to say, you are carded, which is a kind of a repugnant concept when you think about it. And so what you have to do is stop and dig around and produce your identification to prove that you're legit. And so, and does that really accomplish what you want it to accomplish? Because as we've already pointed out, identification can be faked, even if, even government identification. So maybe better to educate people on what a legitimate service or guide dog team actually looks like and what behavior you can expect from that team. So, Vivi, any additional comments on that topic?
I think you both summed it up quite succinctly. I would just harken back to Karen Sharma's presentation and the 2 fundamental questions. If businesses are in doubt, you could ask, is this a service dog? And what task has this dog been trained to do? Which is completely different than what is your disability. I want to make that distinction, right?
Yeah.
Like, is this a service dog? Yes. What task has this dog been trained to do related to your disability? And
yeah. And just to carry on a little bit, and this was already covered, but I think it's worth emphasizing, trained or not trained, but let's hope that, even if you have a trained dog in a public place and the dog begins to misbehave, and by that I mean exceptionally misbehave. Sometimes a service dog, they're dogs, they're not robots. They may inadvertently sniff when they shouldn't, and as long as you correct them and tell them not to, or they may bark if they're startled or somebody steps on them, which has happened. Generally, if a dog really starts to misbehave, it just, what can a business do in that situation? And I just want to tell you about an experience I had. I was at a patio restaurant, and now I don't know if this dog was a service dog or just a pet dog, but it was a small little patio, very closed in. And somebody brought a dog in. It was a small dog, I think, by the sound of the bark. My dog was there, lying quietly under my table. And this dog proceeded to bark incessantly. It was very distracting. And actually, the people beside us, at the table beside us, had someone at the table who was extremely sensitive to loud sounds, and eventually had to end up leaving because no one was telling that person to get that dog under control or get it out. So I guess I just throw it out to either one of you. I mean, do you feel like it's acceptable for people to say to the owner, if your dog isn't behaving, please remove the dog? I mean, does that seem reasonable to you?
Yes, I think so. And it harkens back to what you both have said about the training. If the dog is demonstrating behavior that doesn't correspond to what you know or expect of a trained guide or service dog, then yes, I feel it's perfectly reasonable to ask that the dog be removed from that situation.
And I know that sometimes businesses are a little worried. They're worried that, because they know that there's probably human rights law out there, and they're worried that maybe they're going to be embroiled in some kind of a dispute. But, it's no different than if a person is misbehaving, they're too loud, or they're bothering other people, or doing things they shouldn't be doing in a public place. it's the same kind of scenario. So um,
Yeah,
I'm gonna. Sorry,
if
yeah,
I can
Bill,
just
go ahead,
pop in
please.
there, Yvonne.
Yeah, you bet.
To be perfectly honest with you, number one, it would never happen with my dog. But
Mhm.
number two, if it were to happen that my dog started to either yap incessantly or misbehave, sniffing other dogs, whatever, I would react before the business owner
Yes.
reacted. I would take the initiative and the responsibility to remove my dog first.
Yes,
You're
good
so
point. Yeah.
and you're so helpful, Bill, in helping me transition to my next topic, which is to go back to the training issue, because you are absolutely correct. Our training, one of the things we are taught, or that we is a very essential part of our training, is how our dogs ought to behave in public, and how we maintain that our dogs are trained to perform their tasks in public without fuss. And if something happens, and as I said, they're not robots, and if they're sick or they are uncomfortable and are letting you know that, then it is your job, not, shouldn't wait for somebody to tell you, your job to get that dog out of that public establishment, because it's not good for you, and it's not good for the public, and it's not good for the dog. So, but I do want to go back to training, because Bill, hope that not putting you on the spot, and we heard Karen talk a little bit about training isn't just about training that's done from a particular accredited school or certified training institution. Training is often recognized when it's done, by the owner, as owner trained, as they say. And I think you've had some experience in that area, and I wonder if you'd like to just tell us a little bit about your experience in training your dog.
Sure, by all means. When I started researching assistive animals, she's a PSD, so she's what's called a psychiatric service dog. When I first started, when I made the decision I wanted to go with a service dog, I looked into training opportunities, training options, purchasing a dog that was already trained, and so on. The wait list for PSD is anywhere from 2 to 5 years. The cost was, for me, cost prohibitive. It was between $10,000 and $20,000 for purchasing the dog. And while I was doing my research, I found a fellow in Newfoundland who is a master guide dog trainer. So he trains specifically service dogs, and he's been trained in training those animals. So I connected with him, and I had a few conversations. I asked what sort of abilities I would have to have, and it was basically, if I had been working with dogs previously, I had ever gone through training with dogs previously, he felt that I would have the ability to train my own dog using a document called a Master Guide Training Manual. And it gives you all of the instructions. It gives you the standardized commands to use for training a dog. Because one of the things you don't want is, if you're out in public, for example, and someone has a dog with them and they say sit, you don't want your dog to sit at the same time. So there's this distinction in the commands that we
Yeah.
use for training our dogs. And so I took my girl through basic puppy training. She went to advanced puppy training. She went through the master guide training for service dogs. And then I spent approximately, I would say 18 months, 12 to 18 months, training her in performing her tasks with me. So it's been a long process.
Yeah.
And I would say I probably learned as much from her as she has from me, because it is an interactive process.
Right. Yeah. Thank you so much. And I think it's really important to understand that there are various ways in which dogs can be trained. Erica, I'm very conscious of the time. I think we're at it, are we?
Yeah, so we're at 3:23, Yvonne. And you can keep talking. We can keep doing our panel discussion, but we can go over time till 3:40 p.m. So we have, what is that, 16 more minutes? But we do have quite a few questions from the chat as well. So I can.
Okay. Well, okay, maybe we'll just end our panel discussion here. But I just wanted to emphasize something that Bill alluded to, but I really want to underscore it, and that is thankfully there are a number of schools now here in Canada and also in the United States which provide guide dog training or training for guide dogs and people who wish to use blind people who wish to use guide dogs. And thankfully our American counterpart schools do welcome Canadians, so that's great. So there are opportunities, and a lot of these schools have some pretty significant funding so that the expense to the blind person, it really is very minimal. So I think we're lucky in that way. But when it comes to people, other people who require service dogs like Bill, as Bill pointed out, first of all, the training opportunities are difficult to find. There's a real range of what kind of training opportunities are out there. The standards are inconsistent and vary from trainer to trainer. And not only that, as Bill pointed out, and what I've heard, Bill, is it can range from $20,000 to $30,000 for one dog. Compare that to my situation where my first dog, I paid $150 American, and that was for the dog, the training, the stay at a facility, airline fees, and so on and so on. And subsequent dogs are $50 American, so it's considerably less. So there's a lot of inequities that are still out there when it comes to service dog training and funding and support for people wishing to benefit from the use of a service dog. So those are important human rights issues to keep in mind, and to keep in mind when we're talking about accessibility. So I'm going to just ask quickly, Vivi and Bill, if there's any final thoughts that you have about what people should know about in terms of accessibility and removing barriers for people who use guide or service dogs. Vivi, any last minute thoughts?
I would just say to please remember that guide dogs are allowed everywhere in public. It is the law, so please remember and be mindful of that when you encounter us or another working team in public.
Indeed, well said. And Bill, final thoughts from you?
Yeah, the last thing I would probably say is don't stop asking.
Yeah.
If you're not sure, ask, because the only way we're going to be able to filter out the online $10 fake ID, fake harness issue is for business owners to ask the legitimacy of the service animal and to accept it when they identify it for themselves. It's been my experience that it's fairly easy to spot a fake service dog. So please don't stop asking, is your dog a service dog? Does your dog perform tasks related to your medical condition? And if the answer to both of those questions is yes, and you can observe that the dog is behaving properly, please let us in.
Yeah, indeed. And I'll just end by reminding people that when a dog is working, don't interfere with that dog. The best thing you can ever do is pretend the dog does not exist. The dog needs, and don't worry, the dog has lots of fun. When it goes home, it has lots of toys and treats and fun and love. But when it's working, please don't interfere with it. And I'm still shocked at how many people do not know this. I was at a little fundraiser last night with people that you would kind of think would know better. And I think I had 3, possibly 4 people ask to pet my dog. I was just like, oh, please, have we not gotten past this yet? But anyway, I think, as Erica pointed out, there are some questions. I've not been keeping track, though my phone has been trying to tell me that. Erica, can you let us know what questions are out there?
Great. So one question specifically comes back to the allergy question. So it deals with workplace rights of an allergy sufferer versus the service animal user.
Well, this might be a good question for Karen, but as I said earlier, in both, in case of the person with the allergy, they would have to prove, I would think, that that medical condition was considered a disability. And assuming that that is done, then it's up to the employer to provide an accommodation for both in both instances. One little personal pet peeve I have, and I might be dead wrong about this, but I would say when it comes to taxi drivers, if you're allergic to dogs, maybe you ought not to be driving taxi, because that's an essential requirement of carrying passengers. In other situations where there's more opportunity for accommodation, I would think that would be a reasonable thing for an employer to be expected to do. But I don't know, Karen, do you have anything you would add to that?
I think you really captured it well, Yvonne. Like when we're talking about those kinds of scenarios where, the right of access of a person with a disability who uses a guide dog or service animal or service dog, and we're talking about sort of the relationship there between other individuals and their rights, whether it's, the right of a person maybe who has some kind of other disability that interferes with the presence of a dog. I think the first, issue is establishing that those interferences are more than just trivial. Like they have to be true, a true rights-based issue. So, for that potential allergy sufferer, is this something where you might have a couple of sniffles and maybe it's not great to have that antihistamine every once in a while, or is this truly going to impact your ability of access? So it needs to be more than just a trivial interference for it to trigger a true sort of scenario where we're talking about competing rights. And I think then the focus should always be on finding ways for everybody's rights to coexist, because there's usually lots of room and possibility for that to happen by looking at practical solutions for accommodation, whether that's, additional ventilation, increased spacing, et cetera. There's lots of room for creative solutions before you go the route of restricting someone's rights of equality in this kind of scenario. So in these situations, you've hit the nail on the head, Yvonne. You're talking about, making sure you have a true competition of rights and not just someone's, maybe preference or something that might impact them, but it's not really a significant equality issue. And then if you do have a true, competing rights scenario, finding ways of balancing before you go the route of restricting and look for solutions. And I just want to make one other point, and I think it's been really central in everything that our experts, Vivi, Bill, Yvonne, you've been saying, which is that in conversations around the rights of persons with disabilities who use service dogs, guide dogs, other service animals, the focus really is on the rights of the person with the disability. And there's often so much emphasis placed on the animal in a way that kind of takes us from recognizing that we're talking about an equality issue and the right of persons with disabilities to access public services, employment on an equal level with others. So I think whenever we're having conversations about service animals, we can't forget about or lose sight of the person that's actually at the center of this conversation, and that their rights are the ones that are impacted, and that the service animal is an extension of their being in these kinds of instances. So just another comment there.
They're the rights holder, not the dog. Erica,
that's exactly right. Sometimes people want the commission to regulate dogs, and I say, well, we're really here about enforcing rights for persons with disabilities. So
yeah. Do we have time for more questions?
Yes, I think we can maybe squeeze a couple in. Let's see. So we have another question here about emotional support animal versus a therapy dog. Are these service animals if only for comfort?
Well, what I'd say about that is maybe I would go at it like, what's the difference between a service dog and an emotional support dog? And sometimes they're called therapy dogs. The big difference is training. Service dogs are trained, and they are trained to be in the public. They are trained to perform their tasks in public. And I know that emotional support animals provide an important role in many instances. And, as we've said all the way along, pets are really just about providing emotional support to people. But the big difference is training. And the reason that training is so important is for the, in terms of, you want the animals to behave appropriately in public, not put anybody else at risk, not put their handler at risk. And we know of situations, particularly in the United States, where untrained dogs and other animals have been on planes and really created a huge problem in terms of disrupting passenger welfare, sometimes even biting members of the crew, or biting other passengers, and disrupting service. So, and is that the animal's fault? Certainly not. The animal hasn't been trained how to behave in a confined space where there's lots of other people, lots of different kinds of noises. And, personally, what I feel is that when you put animals in these situations when they haven't been trained, I call it abusive, because that poor animal doesn't know how to behave. And so it panics. And when an animal panics, it just wants to protect itself. So that's my little way of distinguishing between the two. I don't know if anybody else has anything they want to add to that, but, and if not, we can maybe try to squeeze in one more question.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Yvonne, I wholeheartedly support you there. The difference for me, the major difference, is that the dog or any animal has been trained to perform a task related to the medical condition. And that's the important piece.
Yes.
I agree. It's kind of in the name. Service animal performs or provides a service.
Exactly. Any other questions?
Well, thank you very much, panelists. I have to say I have to leave a few minutes here to end the webinar. And Yvonne, thank you so much, and panelists and presenters. So thank you, and I'll just welcome Jette back on screen. That was such a great conversation, and I think we could have spent a whole day just talking. So I think it's something that we'll definitely all want to come back to. And I want to thank all of the people who have typed a question, who are in the question and answer box in the chat. We've taken note of these, and hopefully we'll be able to answer them in the days to come.
Thanks, Erica, and thank you, panelists. And I know we're over time, so I won't spend a lot of time with the individual thank yous, but you see from this panel how important it is to have the conversation about people with disabilities, involve people with disabilities wherever you are, whatever workplace we're talking today or organization. 1 in 4 Manitobans has a disability. You likely have colleagues who have disabilities as well, or participants that do. Start there, start involving people in a conversation about what barriers do people face and how can we create access. And today we heard the subject narrowly for people who use service animals, but we know from our conversations that there are a huge array of barriers that people with disabilities face. And today is certainly a good day to think about those barriers and to celebrate the contribution of people with disabilities to Manitoba, and just listening to those panelists and what they're contributing by being a part of our culture, our economy, or our life. It's so good to have the voices of people with disabilities added to our lives. There were a few closing slides that maybe, Brenton, if you could pull them back up again, because I do want to tell you that, well, for one, here's a slide that gives our contact information again. And I know that the contact information from the Manitoba Human Rights Commission was shared. So please be in touch with us. And there are some other slides with resources that maybe we can share. For instance, lots of people in their early chats, I saw a conversation about training and what training. The reason why the Manitoba Accessibility, the Accessibility for Manitobans Act started with introducing a standard on accessible customer service is because so much of this is based on attitude, on being respectful to everyone who comes through the door, everyone in your life, and what that looks like for people with disabilities. So the training on customer service, it touches on service animals, and it touches on many other subjects as well. We now have online training portal that addresses our first two standards with customer service and employment. That's kind of the minimum training that you will want in your organization. I really want to emphasize that we have great organizations in Manitoba with people with disabilities that offer training and will gear the training to your environment. The law is a blunt hammer, and our legislation affects the dentist's office as it does a daycare, as it does a school. So try to get the training that meets the needs of your specific organization, and contact MB 211. That's the United Ways line that links people to organizations. Next slide, please. I also want to remind people that in terms of the accessibility standard for employment, there is a May 1 deadline for all Manitoba not-for-profits and businesses to comply with the accessibility standard. So we have a lot of resources online. I've listed a few here on this slide, like frequently asked questions and barriers and solutions to the workplace. Those are two new tools that we've got. We also have handbooks and policy guides. We have a guide on how to create an individualized accommodation plan, process, and policy. So those tools will be helpful for organizations. And one of my favorite tools is a 7-minute video that we created about workplace employment, workplace barriers. And know too that thanks to Erica, whose voice you've heard, we have recordings of our various events. And today's event, for instance, would make a great lunch and learn in your organization, and could even during COVID be via Zoom. So think about how you can use some of these tools and keep the discussion going. The next slide, please. I also want to tell you about financial resources. The minister mentioned that we have the Manitoba Accessibility Fund that will be launched in the new year, hopefully with funds going out early in April, which is the beginning of our fiscal year, and we're working on that right now. But our colleagues in municipal relations just announced at the beginning of this week the fund that helps community organizations, including for accessibility renovations. So please go to Manitoba Grants online. It's Manitoba Go, and you have a link right here too, and you'll find out about that fund. So that's for financial resources. And that concludes. I think my next slide is a thank you, and I want to thank again our wonderful presenters who laid the groundwork, and our experts with disabilities. You've all really helped our understanding of service animals today. I also wanted to thank the people behind the scenes, and that's the small but mighty staff at the Manitoba Accessibility Office, and that includes Colleen Waters, Erica Vass, Emily Walker, Tracy McMillan, our intern, Drew Weber, and John Windles, who retired in May of last year. And I've been at the office for 18 years, and it's been a pleasure and a privilege to work with these staff, and that they're a great team, and it's nice to acknowledge that on International Day of Persons with Disabilities. So have a wonderful evening and weekend, and we look forward to your participation in future events of the Manitoba Accessibility Office. Thanks very much. Goodbye.